The cruelest thing about pride is that it never realizes the ground is collapsing until the moment it falls beneath its feet. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Nathaniel Brooks stepped out of the black Escalade with the confidence of a man who believed the world had already chosen his side. The marble steps of the Manhattan courthouse glowed under the gray November sky, while reporters crowded behind steel barricades, shouting his name as camera flashes burst like tiny explosions across the wet pavement. Beside him walked Vanessa Cole, 28 years old, blonde, polished, and smiling as though the courthouse were the entrance to a gala instead of a divorce hearing. Her cream-colored coat brushed against Nathaniel's navy suit, while his hand rested lightly on her back for every camera to see. People whispered immediately. Some recognized Vanessa from social media. Others simply enjoyed the spectacle of a wealthy attorney replacing his wife with someone younger and prettier before the divorce papers were even finalized. Nathaniel enjoyed it too. The slight curve at the corner of his mouth made that obvious. Across the courthouse plaza, Claire Whitmore sat alone on a cold stone bench beneath a bare maple tree. No photographers turned toward her. No reporters asked for comments. Her charcoal wool coat looked simple compared to Vanessa's designer outfit, and the leather folder resting quietly on her lap carried none of the confidence Nathaniel wore like cologne. A gust of wind swept through the plaza, lifting strands of Claire's dark hair across her face, but she barely moved. She simply watched Nathaniel climb the courthouse stairs with another woman at his side, as though 12 years of marriage had been reduced to a public inconvenience. Two older women near the entrance exchanged quiet looks of pity when they noticed Claire sitting alone. One leaned closer to the other and whispered, "Poor thing. Men like him never leave with nothing." Claire heard every word. She lowered her eyes for a moment and tightened her grip around the folder on her lap. Inside were financial statements, property records, and documents Nathaniel once swore she would never understand because she had spent too many years playing artist instead of practicing law like him. Nathaniel paused halfway up the courthouse steps when he finally noticed her. For a brief second, surprise crossed his face. Then it vanished beneath amusement. He leaned toward Vanessa and said something that made her laugh softly before both of them descended the steps again toward Claire. The reporters instantly followed. The sound of expensive shoes against wet concrete echoed through the plaza until Nathaniel stopped directly in front of his wife. "Claire," he said smoothly, glancing around at the cameras gathering nearby. "I honestly expected you to stay home today." Claire slowly looked up at him. Up close, Nathaniel looked exactly like the man magazines love to photograph. Perfect haircut, tailored cashmere coat, gold watch peeking beneath his sleeve. He had spent years mastering the appearance of success. Vanessa folded her arms and offered Claire a sympathetic smile that somehow felt crueler than open mockery. "Nathaniel told me these things can get emotional," she said gently. "I hope today won't be too difficult for you." Claire studied her quietly for a second before standing to her feet. She was almost the same height as Vanessa, but unlike the younger woman, Claire carried herself with stillness instead of performance. Nathaniel gave a short laugh under his breath. "Try not to ask for too much in there," he murmured. "You already took enough years from both of us." The reporters leaned closer. Even the wind seemed to stop moving through the plaza. But instead of reacting, Claire simply brushed a raindrop from her sleeve and looked past Nathaniel toward the courthouse doors behind him. Someone had just entered the building. A tall man in a dark overcoat, silver cufflinks, calm expression. The moment Nathaniel noticed him, the confidence faded from his face for the very first time. The courthouse lobby smelled faintly of polished stone, rainwater, and burnt coffee from a cart near the security line. But the moment Nathaniel Brooks lost color in his face, Claire Whitmore understood something important. The man walking through the revolving doors was not someone Nathaniel expected to see there. The stranger moved calmly through the crowded lobby in a charcoal overcoat tailored so perfectly it seemed almost severe. He did not look toward the cameras. He did not acknowledge the reporters shouting questions near the entrance. Yet several attorneys standing beside the elevators immediately straightened the moment they noticed him. Nathaniel recovered quickly, forcing another smile onto his face before turning back toward Claire. "Do not start imagining dramatic rescues," he said quietly enough that only she could hear. "Nobody here is coming to save you." Vanessa slipped her arm through Nathaniel's and tilted her head with practiced sympathy. "Honestly, Claire, this process will go smoother if everyone stays realistic." Claire looked at her for a long moment. Vanessa could not have been older than 28, but she already wore the expression of someone who believed proximity to wealth was the same thing as power. Around them, reporters kept snapping photographs while courthouse employees pretended not to watch. Claire noticed a young court clerk standing behind the reception desk nearby. His nameplate read Daniel Mercer. He could not stop glancing between Nathaniel and Claire, his expression tightening each time another photographer laughed quietly at the scene unfolding near the entrance. Nathaniel adjusted the cuff of his suit jacket and lowered his voice again. "You signed the preliminary agreement 6 months ago. The penthouse stays with me. The Hamptons property stays with me. The investment accounts stay protected. There is no reason to drag this out." Claire held the leather folder closer against her coat. "I signed papers you presented after midnight while I was heavily medicated from surgery," she replied evenly. "That is not protection. That is manipulation." The smile on Nathaniel's face hardened slightly. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably for the first time as nearby reporters leaned closer, hoping for conflict. One woman holding a microphone whispered to her cameraman, "Now this is getting interesting." Nathaniel gave a dry laugh. "Claire, you spent 12 years decorating houses and hosting charity dinners. Please do not pretend you suddenly understand corporate law." The sentence landed exactly the way he intended. A few people nearby exchanged faint smirks. Someone farther back muttered, "She is probably trying to get a bigger settlement." Claire heard that too. She heard all of it. But instead of reacting emotionally, she slowly opened the folder in her hands and removed several pages clipped neatly together. The movement alone made Nathaniel's jaw tighten. "You transferred nearly $9 million into offshore accounts 3 weeks before filing for divorce," Claire said softly. "And you signed those transfers through shell companies registered under employees who do not even know their names were used." Vanessa immediately looked toward Nathaniel. "What is she talking about?" she asked under her breath. Nathaniel did not answer. The lobby suddenly felt smaller. Even the reporters stopped talking for a moment. Daniel Mercer, the young court clerk, stared openly now, his fingers frozen above the keyboard at the reception desk. Claire continued calmly, "I spent years believing I was married to an honest man. Turns out I was only married to someone skilled at appearances." Nathaniel stepped closer to her, lowering his voice into something sharper. "Be very careful what accusations you make in public." Claire met his stare without blinking. Truth is not an accusation. For the first time all morning, Nathaniel looked genuinely irritated instead of amused. The elevators opened behind them with a metallic chime, and several attorneys stepped out into the lobby. Among them was the silver-haired man from the entrance. He paused briefly when he saw Claire standing there, then glanced toward the documents in her hand before continuing down the hall without saying a word. Nathaniel watched him disappear around the corner, tension flickering across his face again. Then, suddenly, Nathaniel turned toward the reporters and raised his voice just enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Since Claire believes she has uncovered some massive conspiracy," he announced smoothly, "perhaps she would like to explain those accusations in front of the judge right now instead of hiding behind emotional stories." Every camera in the lobby immediately swung toward her. Every lens in the courthouse lobby pointed toward Claire Whitmore now, and she could feel the atmosphere changing around her the same way temperature changes before a storm. People were no longer watching out of curiosity alone. They were waiting for her to fail. Nathaniel Brooks stood at the center of the marble lobby with the confidence of a man who had spent his entire career controlling narratives, while Claire remained alone beneath the cold fluorescent lights, holding a folder most people already assumed contained nothing important. One reporter near the elevators raised her microphone immediately. "Mrs. Brooks, are you accusing your husband of financial fraud?" Another voice followed before Claire could answer. "Do you actually have evidence? Or is this part of a settlement strategy?" The questions came rapidly after that. Cameras edged closer. Security guards watched carefully from the metal detectors, while courthouse employees slowed their steps just enough to listen. Claire noticed Vanessa tightening her grip around Nathaniel's arm again. though the younger woman's polished smile no longer looked as natural as before. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, then spread his hands with almost theatrical calm. "My wife is emotional," he said to the reporters. "I understand that divorce is painful, but throwing around dramatic accusations does not change legal facts." Several people nearby nodded automatically. Nathaniel had the kind of voice that made lies sound reasonable. Claire knew that better than anyone. For years she had watched him charm investors, judges, donors, and entire rooms full of strangers while privately treating every relationship like a transaction. The worst part was not his arrogance. It was how easily people trusted it. Daniel Mercer, the young court clerk behind the reception desk, looked visibly uncomfortable now. Claire caught him glancing down at the financial documents still in her hand before quickly looking away again when Nathaniel noticed him. "You signed every agreement voluntarily," Nathaniel continued smoothly. "You had attorneys review everything. You had access to every account." Claire stared at him for a moment before speaking quietly. "You made sure the attorneys worked for you." A faint murmur spread through the crowd. Nathaniel smiled again, but this time it looked thinner. "Claire," he said patiently, almost like a parent correcting a child, "you walked away from your architecture career 11 years ago. You have not managed a financial account since George W. Bush was president. Let us not pretend you suddenly became an expert in offshore banking." A few reporters laughed softly at that. Vanessa lowered her eyes, hiding a small smile behind perfectly manicured fingers. The humiliation settled heavily into the room, exactly the way Nathaniel intended. Claire could almost feel the crowd deciding who they believed. Then she noticed something small resting near the reception desk. A black leather business card holder had been left partially open beside Daniel Mercer's keyboard. One silver-edged card inside carried the name Hail Dominion Capital embossed in dark lettering. Claire recognized the logo instantly. Her eyes lifted toward the hallway where the silver-haired man had disappeared earlier. Nathaniel followed her gaze for half a second before stepping directly into her line of sight again. "You know what I think?" he asked quietly. "I think you cannot stand the fact that life moved on." Claire said nothing. Nathaniel leaned slightly closer. "You were comfortable being my wife," he continued. "The dinners, the vacations, the penthouse overlooking Central Park. But comfort is not contribution." The words landed harder than the cameras flashing around them. Even Vanessa shifted uneasily this time. Somewhere deeper in the courthouse, a judge's clerk announced the next hearing schedule over the intercom system, but nobody in the lobby seemed to move anymore. They were all waiting, watching, judging. Claire slowly closed the folder in her hands. "You taught me something valuable, Nathaniel," she said softly. "The people who smile most confidently in public usually have the most to hide." Nathaniel gave a sharp laugh and turned toward the reporters again. "Perfect," he announced loudly. "Since my wife believes she has uncovered criminal activity, let us settle this properly." He reached into his coat pocket, removed a folded document, and held it out toward Claire in full view of every camera in the lobby. "Sign the final settlement agreement right now," he said, "or explain publicly why you are refusing $20 million and trying to destroy both our reputations." The folded settlement agreement remained suspended between them like a final insult wrapped in expensive paper. Every camera in the courthouse lobby stayed fixed on Claire Whitmore, while Nathaniel Brooks held the document out with perfect composure, giving the performance of a generous man forced to deal with an unreasonable woman. Rainwater still clung to the shoulders of his cashmere coat, and under the white courthouse lights he looked every inch the successful attorney Manhattan magazines loved to celebrate. Beside him, Vanessa Cole stood silently now, though the confidence she carried earlier had begun to fade around the edges. Claire could see it in the way her fingers tightened around her handbag strap. $20 million, one reporter whispered under her breath. "Most people would sign immediately." Another voice answered quietly, "Not if she thinks she can get more." The judgment spread quickly through the lobby. Claire felt it moving from person to person like a current. To them, she was no longer a wife defending herself. She was becoming a greedy ex-wife refusing to let go of a wealthy man. Nathaniel knew exactly how to shape public opinion. He always had. Claire looked down at the settlement papers without touching them. Thick legal language filled the pages beneath Nathaniel's signature. Buried somewhere inside was the same trap she had already lived through once before. A surrender disguised as fairness. Nathaniel lowered his voice just enough to sound intimate, while the cameras still captured every word. "Take the deal, Claire," he said. "Walk away with dignity while you still can." Claire slowly lifted her eyes toward him. "Dignity was never yours to offer me." For one brief moment, silence spread through the entire lobby. Even the reporters stopped speaking. Somewhere behind the security checkpoint, a printer hummed softly in the distance. Nathaniel's expression hardened almost instantly afterward. The warmth vanished from his face completely now, revealing the colder man beneath the polished charm. "Then perhaps this process needs to become more formal," he replied. He turned toward the reception desk. "Excuse me," he called sharply. "Can someone escort my wife to a private waiting area until she decides whether she wants to cooperate?" The sentence hit harder than shouting would have. A few people nearby exchanged awkward glances. Claire noticed Daniel Mercer freeze behind the desk again. The young clerk looked down at the keyboard, then back toward Claire as though debating whether to speak. But fear won. It usually did in places like this. Two courthouse security officers approached slowly from near the metal detectors. They were polite, but the meaning was clear. Nathaniel was removing her from the center of the room because he no longer controlled the conversation. Vanessa stepped slightly aside, creating space between herself and Claire as though avoiding embarrassment by association. One of the reporters muttered quietly, "This is getting ugly." Claire could feel every pair of eyes following her now. People who had never met her were already deciding what kind of woman she must be. Difficult, emotional, desperate. The familiar cruelty of public opinion settled over the room with suffocating weight. Yet Claire did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply closed the folder in her hands carefully and looked toward the nearest courthouse window where rain streaked softly across the glass. "You know what the strange thing is, Nathaniel?" she said calmly. "People like you spend so much time protecting appearances that you forget truth does not disappear just because a room chooses comfort over honesty." The silence that followed felt deeper this time. Even Nathaniel seemed caught off guard for half a second. One of the security officers hesitated before speaking softly. "Ma'am, we are going to need you to step outside the lobby for now." Claire nodded once. No anger, no tears, just quiet acceptance. She slipped the documents back into her leather folder and turned toward the courthouse doors while camera flashes followed every step. As she passed the reception desk, Daniel Mercer moved suddenly, almost nervously, and a small black business card slid from beneath his paperwork onto the marble floor near Claire's feet. "Hail Dominion Capital." Silver lettering against matte black leather. Claire paused only long enough to pick it up before continuing toward the exit. Outside, cold November rain drifted across the courthouse steps while traffic lights reflected against the wet pavement in red and gold streaks. Claire stood alone beneath the gray sky, holding the card tightly in one hand as the heavy courthouse doors closed behind her with a sound that felt strangely final. Cold rain drifted across the courthouse plaza in thin silver lines, while Claire Whitmore stood beneath the stone overhang near the entrance, the black business card still resting quietly in her hand. Traffic moved slowly along Center Street, headlights glowing against the wet pavement like blurred ribbons of gold. Behind the heavy courthouse doors, reporters continued chasing louder stories, but outside, the city suddenly felt strangely distant. Claire looked down at the silver lettering again. "Hail Dominion Capital." Even after all the years she spent attending charity galas beside Nathaniel Brooks, she still recognized powerful names immediately. Hail Dominion was the kind of investment empire people discussed carefully in Manhattan restaurants. Quiet money, old influence, the kind that did not need cameras to prove it existed. Her fingers tightened slightly around the card before she slipped it carefully into her coat pocket. For a moment, she simply stood there listening to the rain. 12 years. That was what hurt the most. Not the penthouse. Not the settlement money. Not even Vanessa. It was the memory of believing she had built a life with someone who once promised to protect her heart instead of publicly dismantling it. Claire remembered a rooftop dinner from years earlier, long before Nathaniel became famous in corporate law circles. They had been younger then. Per or two. The city skyline shimmered around them while cheap candles flickered against the summer wind. Nathaniel had taken her hand and said, "No matter how successful I become, I never want us to turn into people who embarrass each other to feel powerful." Claire closed her eyes briefly against the rain. Funny how certain promises survived longer in memory than in reality. The courthouse doors opened behind her with a burst of warm air. Daniel Mercer stepped outside, holding 2 paper coffee cups awkwardly beneath his umbrella. He hesitated when he saw Claire still standing there alone. "Ma'am," he said nervously, approaching slowly. "I thought maybe you could use something warm." Claire looked surprised for the first time all morning. The young clerk held out one of the cups carefully. "It is just regular coffee," he added quickly. "Nothing fancy." Claire accepted it with both hands, feeling the warmth immediately against her cold fingers. "Thank you, Daniel." He looked embarrassed that she remembered his name. "I should not say this," he admitted quietly, glancing back toward the courthouse entrance. "But what happened in there did not feel right." Claire gave a faint smile. "Most people notice unfairness," she said softly. "They are just afraid of what it costs to acknowledge it." Daniel lowered his eyes for a second. Rain tapped gently against the top of his umbrella while taxis splashed through shallow puddles nearby. "Mr. Brooks has influence," he murmured. "People inside that building do not usually stand against men like him." Claire took a small sip of coffee before answering. "Then they become part of the reason men like him continue believing they are untouchable." Daniel studied her carefully after that, almost confused by how calm she remained. Most people leaving a public humiliation would have been crying or furious. Claire only looked tired. But beneath the exhaustion was something steadier. Something Nathaniel clearly no longer understood. "You know," Daniel said carefully, "when they escorted you out, you still looked like the only person there with dignity." Claire smiled sadly at that. "Dignity is expensive," she replied. "That is why so few people hold on to it when life becomes difficult." For several quiet seconds, neither of them spoke. The rain softened slightly now, turning into a mist across the courthouse steps. Then Claire heard it. A low engine approaching from the far side of the street. Smooth. Expensive. Deliberate. Daniel turned first. A long black sedan rolled silently toward the curb, its polished surface reflecting the city lights like dark glass. The moment it stopped, the atmosphere around them shifted completely. Even the courthouse security guards near the entrance straightened subtly. Claire watched as the rear passenger door opened slowly, and polished black dress shoes stepped onto the wet pavement beneath the gray Manhattan sky. The man who stepped out of the black sedan carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that made people instinctively lower their voices without understanding why. Rain slid across the shoulders of his charcoal overcoat, while polished black shoes touched the wet pavement with measured calm. He looked to be in his early 40s, tall, composed, silver beginning to thread lightly through dark hair at his temples. No security team surrounded him. No dramatic entrance announced him. Yet the atmosphere outside the courthouse shifted immediately the moment he arrived. Daniel Mercer straightened beside Claire almost unconsciously. Even the courthouse guards near the entrance exchanged quick glances before one of them opened the glass doors wider without being asked. Claire recognized him instantly now. Damian Hale, founder of Hale Dominion Capital. The same man she had glimpsed earlier inside the courthouse hallway. Damian closed the car door quietly behind him before his eyes settled on Claire standing beneath the rain-darkened stone overhang. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Traffic hissed through the wet Manhattan streets nearby, while reporters inside remained distracted by Nathaniel Brooks and the spectacle still unfolding in the lobby. Damian's gaze lowered briefly toward the black business card still visible in Claire's hand. "I wondered whether Daniel would actually give you that," he said calmly. Daniel looked startled. "Sir, I did not exactly give it to her," he admitted nervously. Damian's expression softened almost invisibly. Sometimes decent people help others before they realize they are being brave. Daniel looked down immediately, embarrassed by the comment. Claire studied Damian carefully now. Unlike Nathaniel, nothing about him seemed designed for attention. No exaggerated confidence. No performance. Just stillness. The kind powerful people rarely needed to fake. "You knew my husband was inside," Claire said quietly. "Former husband," Damian corrected gently. Rain drifted between them in soft silver lines while courthouse lights reflected across the sedan's dark surface. Claire noticed the driver waiting silently behind the wheel without looking toward them once. Everything about Damian Hale's world seemed disciplined, controlled. "Mr. Hale," Claire began carefully, "if this is about the architectural proposal your firm requested last month, I can explain why I delayed responding." Damien shook his head once. This is not about architecture. Before Claire could answer, the courthouse doors opened again behind them with sudden noise and movement. Reporters spilled outside carrying cameras and microphones while Nathaniel Brooks emerged beside Vanessa, still smiling for the press. But the moment Nathaniel saw Damien standing beside Claire, his entire body stiffened almost imperceptibly. Vanessa noticed it too. "Nathaniel?" she asked quietly. Nathaniel ignored her completely. One reporter immediately turned toward Damien in surprise. "Mr. Hale," she called out quickly, "are you connected to the Brooks divorce proceedings?" More cameras swung toward the sidewalk instantly. Nathaniel descended the courthouse steps slowly now, no longer wearing the relaxed confidence from earlier. Claire watched him carefully. For the first time all morning, he looked uncertain. Damien remained perfectly calm. "Good afternoon, Nathaniel," he said once Nathaniel reached the bottom step. Nathaniel forced a tight smile. "I did not realize Hale Dominion had interests in family court matters." Damien slipped one hand calmly into his coat pocket. "We do not." Nathaniel glanced briefly toward Claire before lowering his voice. "Then I assume this meeting is unrelated." Damien looked directly at him now. "Actually," he replied evenly. "It became related the moment your financial transfers began intersecting with companies currently under federal review." The rain seemed louder suddenly. Nathaniel's expression changed instantly. Not dramatic panic. Something colder. Calculation breaking apart in real time. Vanessa stared between the two men in confusion while reporters sensed the shift without fully understanding it yet. Claire remained silent beside Damien, though she could feel the tension tightening through the entire sidewalk around them. Nathaniel tried to recover quickly. "You are making a very serious implication." Damien's face revealed nothing. "No," he said quietly. "The implication was your mistake. The evidence is mine." The sidewalk outside the courthouse had gone almost completely silent except for the rain and the distant sound of traffic moving through Lower Manhattan. Reporters stood frozen beneath umbrellas while cameras remained locked on Nathaniel Brooks, whose carefully controlled expression was beginning to crack around the edges for the first time all morning. Vanessa Cole looked from Damien Hale to Nathaniel with growing confusion, as though realizing she had stepped into a story far larger than the glamorous divorce drama she thought she understood. Nathaniel forced a short laugh, but the sound carried no confidence anymore. "Federal review?" he repeated carefully. "I think you are exaggerating the situation." Damien Hale remained perfectly composed beneath the gray sky. "No," he replied evenly. "I am simplifying it." The sentence settled heavily into the cold air. Claire Whitmore stood beside him quietly, her dark coat dampened by rain, while camera flashes reflected softly across the wet courthouse steps. She did not look triumphant. She only looked tired of watching dishonesty perform itself in public. One of the reporters finally stepped forward again. "Mr. Hale, are you saying the allegations Mrs. Brooks mentioned are real?" Before Damien answered, another voice unexpectedly spoke first. "They are real." Everyone turned immediately. Daniel Mercer stood near the courthouse entrance, clutching several folders tightly against his chest. His face had gone pale, but he continued walking forward anyway. Nathaniel stared at him in disbelief. "Excuse me." Daniel swallowed hard. "The transfer documents she mentioned were flagged 3 weeks ago during internal review," he admitted, his voice shaking slightly. "I saw them myself." Nathaniel's expression darkened instantly. "You are a clerk," he snapped. "You have absolutely no authority to discuss confidential filings." Daniel hesitated only briefly before answering. "Maybe not, but I also know when something feels wrong." The reporters erupted immediately after that. Questions collided from every direction while cameras pushed closer through the rain. Vanessa slowly stepped away from Nathaniel now, the distance between them growing visible enough for every lens to capture. Claire looked toward Daniel carefully. The young man was terrified. She could see it in the way his fingers trembled around the folders. Yet he had spoken anyway. Nathaniel noticed Claire watching him and turned sharply toward her. "Did you plan this?" he demanded quietly. "Was this entire performance arranged?" Claire met his anger with calm exhaustion instead of satisfaction. "Nathaniel," she said softly, "not everything happening to you is a conspiracy. Sometimes consequences simply arrive late." He looked as though he wanted to argue again, but Damien spoke before he could. Your offshore accounts intersected with two shell corporations currently under investigation for securities manipulation, Damien explained calmly. One of those corporations attempted to acquire property connected to Hale Dominion development projects. Several reporters immediately began typing furiously into their phones. Nathaniel glanced around the sidewalk now and seemed to realize the crowd no longer looked at him with admiration. They were studying him differently, carefully, suspiciously. Claire could almost feel the shift happening in real time. Then another truth surfaced unexpectedly. One older reporter lowered her camera slightly and looked toward Claire with sudden recognition. "Wait," she murmured. "Claire Whitmore." Several heads turned toward her. The reporter stepped closer slowly. 3 years ago, were you the anonymous donor who funded the Midtown Women's Housing Initiative? Claire's eyes widened faintly. That information was supposed to remain private. The silence afterward felt deeper than all the shouting before it. Daniel looked stunned. Even Vanessa stared openly now. The housing initiative had become one of the most respected emergency housing programs in New York for women rebuilding their lives after divorce, eviction, or financial abuse. Nathaniel looked genuinely confused. "You funded that?" he asked. Claire glanced toward the wet city streets before answering quietly. "I used profits from my architectural licensing agreements." Nathaniel blinked slowly. "You told me those projects barely made money." Claire gave a faint, almost sad smile. "That is because every time I succeeded at something, you needed it to feel smaller than your success." No one spoke after that. The rain continued falling softly around them, while reporters lowered their microphones one by one. The woman many people had mocked less than an hour earlier no longer looked like a desperate ex-wife standing outside a courthouse. She looked like someone the entire city had misunderstood. By late afternoon, the rain above Manhattan had softened into a gray mist that clung quietly to the courthouse windows, while the atmosphere around Nathaniel Brooks continued unraveling piece by piece. News alerts had already begun spreading across financial networks and legal blogs. Reporters no longer asked Claire Whitmore whether she was seeking revenge. Now they asked Nathaniel whether federal investigators had contacted his firm. The difference in tone was impossible to miss. Nathaniel stood near the bottom courthouse steps staring at his phone while messages arrived faster than he could read them. His law partners had stopped answering his calls. One board member from his firm released a carefully worded statement announcing an immediate internal compliance review. Another headline confirmed that several offshore accounts connected to shell corporations had been temporarily frozen pending investigation. None of it looked dramatic from the outside. No handcuffs, no shouting, just the slow collapse of a reputation built too heavily on appearances. Vanessa Cole quietly stepped away from the courthouse cameras altogether. By the time most reporters realized she was gone, her car had already disappeared into downtown traffic. Nathaniel noticed eventually, but he looked strangely unsurprised. Claire watched all of it from beneath the stone overhang beside Damian Hale and Daniel Mercer. The city moved around them normally now. Taxi horns echoed through the avenue. Steam rose from street grates. Courthouse employees hurried home carrying briefcases beneath umbrellas. Yet something fundamental had shifted in the way people looked at Claire. Earlier that morning, strangers had viewed her with pity or suspicion. Now several reporters approached carefully, almost respectfully. One older woman from a local newspaper lowered her notebook and said quietly, "Mrs. Whitmore, the housing initiative you funded helped my sister leave an abusive marriage 2 years ago. She never knew who paid for the legal support program." Claire seemed uncomfortable with the attention. "It was never supposed to be public," she replied softly. The reporter nodded slowly. Maybe that is why it mattered. Daniel stood nearby, listening silently. Claire turned toward him after a moment. "You should go home," she told him gently. "You have already done enough today." Daniel shook his head immediately. "No, ma'am. I spent too long watching people stay quiet because powerful men made honesty feel dangerous." Claire studied him carefully before smiling faintly. "Then promise me something instead. Anything. Do not become cruel while trying to become brave." The words seemed to catch him off guard. Around them, cameras continued flashing toward Nathaniel as another attorney arrived carrying documents for him to sign. Claire noticed the exhaustion finally settling into Nathaniel's posture now. For the first time since she had known him, he looked like a man discovering that status could disappear faster than character. Damien glanced toward Claire quietly. "There is one more thing you should know," he said. Nathaniel looked up sharply at that. Damien continued calmly. 3 years ago, Hale Dominion Capital reviewed architectural proposals for our national redevelopment program. The only submission we approved unanimously was yours. Claire blinked in surprise. You never revealed your firm was behind the review committee. Because your proposal won anonymously, Damien replied. No names. No personal connections. Just merit. Nathaniel stared at Claire in complete disbelief. That project generated almost $40 million in development contracts, he said slowly. Claire looked toward him with quiet sadness. Yes, she answered. It did. The realization hit Nathaniel visibly now. During all the years he mocked her smaller career, dismissed her work, and treated her accomplishments like hobbies beside his legal empire, Claire had quietly built influence of her own. Not through manipulation. Not through spectacle. Through talent. Through consistency. Through kindness nobody knew existed because she never needed applause for it. Nathaniel lowered his eyes briefly as the rain mist drifted across the courthouse steps. I thought I was the one carrying our future, he admitted quietly, almost to himself. Claire looked at him for a long moment before answering with calm honesty instead of triumph. That was the problem, Nathaniel, she said softly. You never noticed I was carrying yours too. The courthouse plaza looked completely different by evening. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the sidewalks glossy beneath the amber glow of Manhattan streetlights, while people moved more quietly than they had that morning. Reporters were packing away equipment now instead of chasing scandal. The loudness had faded. What remained felt more human. Claire Whitmore stood near the edge of the courthouse steps, watching steam rise slowly from the city streets while cold air drifted through the avenue. For the first time all day, she could breathe without feeling like the entire world was pressing against her chest. Damien Hale stood a respectful distance away, speaking softly with one of his attorneys, while Daniel Mercer waited nearby, holding a folder against his coat. Nathaniel Brooks remained alone near the courthouse entrance. The confidence that once surrounded him had disappeared completely now. No reporters crowded around him anymore. No cameras searched for his reaction. Even the city seemed to have quietly moved on. He looked older standing there beneath the courthouse lights. Smaller somehow. Claire noticed him watching her after several long minutes. Then, slowly, Nathaniel walked toward her across the wet stone plaza. There was no performance left in him now. No polished smile. No carefully measured charm. Just exhaustion. He stopped a few feet away and lowered his eyes briefly before speaking. I spent years thinking success meant being admired, he admitted quietly. Somewhere along the way, I stopped noticing the difference between admiration and fear. Claire listened silently. The distant sound of traffic echoed between the buildings while cold wind moved gently through the plaza. Nathaniel looked toward the courthouse windows behind them. I embarrassed you publicly because I thought humiliation would make me feel powerful again, he continued. Instead, it only revealed what I had already become. Claire studied him carefully. For the first time in years, he sounded honest. Not defensive. Not manipulative. Just honest. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. I am sorry, Claire. The apology settled softly into the evening air. Not dramatic. Not desperate. Just late. Claire looked at the man she once built a life beside and realized something surprising. The anger was gone. Somewhere between the courthouse lobby and the rain-soaked sidewalk outside, she had stopped needing him to lose in order for herself to heal. I believe you are sorry, she said gently. But apologies cannot repair years of choosing ego over kindness. Nathaniel nodded once. He did not argue. I know. Nearby, Daniel shifted awkwardly as though preparing to leave, but Claire turned toward him before he could disappear quietly into the night. Daniel, she called softly. He looked startled. Damien approached beside her and handed Daniel a small envelope. Hale Dominion is expanding its legal ethics and compliance division, Damien explained calmly. We value people willing to protect truth even when it is uncomfortable. Daniel stared at the envelope in disbelief. Sir, I do not even know what to say. Claire smiled faintly. Then say yes before courage turns back into fear. Daniel laughed softly for the first time all day, his eyes visibly emotional beneath the courthouse lights. Across the street, traffic rolled steadily through Manhattan while office towers shimmered against the darkening sky. The city felt endless again instead of suffocating. Damien opened the rear passenger door of the black sedan for Claire, but before she entered, She paused and looked back once more at the courthouse steps where her entire day had begun. The same place where people once looked at her with pity now felt strangely distant, almost unimportant. Nathaniel remained standing quietly beneath the lights, hands in his coat pockets, finally understanding that wealth could protect reputation for only so long before character revealed itself anyway. Claire stepped toward the car slowly, the cold evening air brushing against her face. Damien waited patiently beside the open door without rushing her. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Claire looked up at the Manhattan skyline glowing against the night and smiled with peaceful exhaustion instead of sadness. "For the first time in a very long time," she answered. "I think I finally am." She entered the car gently while the city lights reflected across the wet pavement outside. And that night, everyone who witnessed what happened at the courthouse remembered something far more valuable than scandal or money. Dignity does not disappear when people fail to recognize it. It simply waits for truth to enter the room.